A struggling cafe owner unknowingly helps a mysterious stranger, only to discover that his final gift will change her life forever. But just when she thinks it's a blessing, a shocking truth threatens to take everything away. The rain fell in steady sheets over Boston, drumming against the windows of Maple and Soul, Olivia Carter's small restaurant. The scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee filled the warm space, a stark contrast to the cold, damp night outside. The place was quiet, save for the occasional clinking of silverware and the soft hum of jazz playing from the old speakers mounted above the counter. Olivia wiped down the wooden counter for the third time that evening, her mind occupied with the mounting bills tucked away in the back office. Business had been slow, and she was painfully aware that if things didn't pick up soon, she would have to make some tough decisions. Still, she refused to let the worry show on her face. One day at a time, she told herself. The front door creaked open, and a gust of cold air rushed in, sending a shiver down Olivia's spine. She looked up to see a man step inside, his coat soaked through, his shoes leaving wet footprints on the tile floor. He hesitated, as if reconsidering whether he should have come in at all. His appearance was unremarkable at first glance, just another man caught in the rain, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet dignity beneath the exhaustion in his posture. His face was lined with age, his beard peppered with gray. His eyes, though tired, held a depth that Olivia couldn't quite place. "Welcome," she said, offering a small smile. "Rough night out there." The man nodded, rubbing his hands together as if trying to chase away the lingering chill. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "Didn't expect the storm to be this bad." Olivia glanced around the nearly empty restaurant. Only 2 regulars remained, sipping their coffee in silence. It was close to closing time, but something made her hesitate before turning him away. Instead, she gestured toward a booth near the window. "Have a seat," she said. "I'll bring you something warm." He hesitated as if about to refuse, but then nodded and walked over to the booth. He sank into the seat with a quiet sigh, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Olivia disappeared into the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with a steaming bowl of tomato soup and a thick slice of freshly baked bread. "On the house," she said, placing the meal in front of him. His head snapped up, surprise flashing in his eyes. I can pay," he said quickly, reaching into his pocket, but Olivia shook her head. "Don't worry about it," she replied. "Just eat." For a moment, he simply stared at the food, as if struggling to believe that it was really for him. Then slowly, he picked up the spoon and took a careful sip. A faint, almost imperceptible smile crossed his lips, though he said nothing. He ate in silence, savoring every bite, while Olivia busied herself around the restaurant, giving him space but keeping a discreet eye on him. Minutes passed, stretching into nearly half an hour. The rain continued to hammer against the windows, but inside, the warmth of the restaurant created a bubble of quiet comfort. When he finished, he wiped his mouth with a napkin and glanced at Olivia, seeming to hesitate once more. Then, with slow and deliberate movements, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and placed it on the table beside the empty bowl. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer now, "for your kindness." Before Olivia could respond, he stood, pulling his damp coat tighter around his shoulders. He gave her one last, lingering look, one filled with something unspoken, as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out into the storm. Olivia watched him disappear into the rain, a strange feeling settling in her chest. Something about him lingered, like the scent of coffee that clung to the air even after the cup was empty. She glanced down at the table, her eyes landing on the folded paper he had left behind. Curiosity tugged at her, but she hesitated before picking it up. Whatever was inside, she had a feeling it would change something. Maybe everything. The rain poured harder outside, the neon glow of the restaurant sign reflecting on the wet pavement. And inside, Olivia stood motionless, staring at the envelope as the weight of the night settled around her. The envelope felt heavier in Olivia's hands than it should have. It was damp from the condensation of the warm restaurant air. Yet the ink on the front remained crisp and clear. There was no name, no address. Just her restaurant's name written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Maple and Soul. She hesitated. It wasn't every day a stranger left behind something like this. Finally, curiosity won over. She carefully unfolded the paper inside and began to read. The note was brief but carefully worded. Miss Carter, thank you for your kindness tonight. It may not seem like much to you, but a warm meal can be more than food to someone who has lost their way. I have little to offer in return except my gratitude. But perhaps that will change soon. Take care. R.B. Olivia reread the note, her brow furrowing slightly. R.B. whoever he was. He had gone out of his way to leave this message. But why? What did he mean by, perhaps that will change soon? Everything okay? She looked up to find Ethan standing by the counter. His arms crossed. Her younger brother had stopped by to check on her, as he often did after his law classes. His sharp eyes flickered to the note in her hands. A customer left it behind, she said, sliding it across the counter for him to see. Ethan read it quickly, then raised an eyebrow. Sounds cryptic. Who was this guy? Olivia shrugged. Just someone passing through, I guess. Or someone who thinks he owes you something. Ethan studied the handwriting. You sure you don't recognize the name? She shook her head. He didn't even tell me his full name. Ethan exhaled, clearly unconvinced. Be careful, Liv. People don't just leave notes like this for no reason. She wanted to brush off his concern, but something about the letter stuck with her. Who exactly was R.B.? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning? The morning sun filtered through the windows of Maple and Soul, casting golden hues on the wooden tables. Olivia stood behind the counter, running through the morning's tasks, but her thoughts were still tangled in the events of the previous night. The note from R.B. sat in the drawer beneath the register, folded neatly but refusing to leave her mind. The bell above the door chimed, pulling her from her thoughts. Expecting a regular customer, Olivia turned with a polite smile, but it quickly faded when she saw the woman who had just walked in. She was impeccably dressed, her tailored navy blue suit crisp and professional. A sleek leather bag hung from her shoulder, and she moved with a practiced confidence. Her piercing gaze locked onto Olivia as she approached the counter. Miss Carter? The woman asked, her voice smooth and composed. Yes, Olivia responded, her brows knitting together. The woman extended a business card. Margaret Reed, attorney at law. I'm here regarding Richard Bennett, Margaret continued, her voice even but firm. Olivia's breath caught. R.B. A chill ran down her spine as she slowly took the card. I don't understand, she admitted. Why would a lawyer be here about him? Margaret sighed, as if bracing herself for a reaction. Mr. Bennett passed away 2 days ago. Olivia's stomach dropped. She gripped the edge of the counter for support, the weight of those words pressing into her. He was just here last night, she whispered, more to herself than to Margaret. Margaret gave a small nod. I know. You were one of the last people to see him. Olivia swallowed hard, her mind racing. She barely knew the man, yet something about the way he had lingered in her restaurant, the letter he had left behind. It all felt purposeful. Margaret's gaze softened, but her tone remained professional. Mr. Bennett left instructions that I contact you personally after his passing. Olivia's eyes snapped back to hers. Why? What does this have to do with me? Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out a thick envelope. He included you in his will. Silence stretched between them as Olivia stared at the envelope, her pulse hammering in her ears. That doesn't make any sense, Olivia said, shaking her head. I barely knew him. Margaret placed the envelope on the counter. Nonetheless, his wishes were clear. You've been named as a beneficiary. A deep unease settled in Olivia's chest. She had no connection to Richard Bennett, no reason to be in his will. And yet, Here was a lawyer standing in her restaurant, presenting her with something that could very well change everything. "What did he leave me?" Olivia finally asked, her voice quieter now. Margaret hesitated before replying, as if choosing her words carefully. "I think it would be best if we discussed this somewhere private, perhaps over coffee." Olivia glanced around the restaurant, still mostly empty in the early morning. Her hands felt cold despite the warmth of the sun spilling in through the windows. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Yeah, let's talk." She had no idea what she was walking into, but something told her that her life was about to take a turn she never could have expected. The cafe felt quieter than usual, though Olivia knew it was just her mind playing tricks on her. She sat across from Margaret Reed, the lawyer who had arrived with news that still felt surreal. The envelope lay untouched between them, its presence almost taunting. "Mr. Bennet had very specific instructions regarding his estate," Margaret began, stirring a spoon through her untouched coffee. "And you, Miss Carter, are a central part of those instructions." Olivia let out a soft breath, shaking her head. "This doesn't make any sense. I only met him once." Margaret studied her, as if assessing whether she was ready to hear what came next. Then she slid a folder across the table. Olivia hesitated before opening it, her eyes scanning the official documents. Her heart pounded as she recognized the name at the top. Richard Bennet. "What exactly did he leave me?" she asked, voice steady but laced with caution. Margaret folded her hands together. Richard Bennet was the owner of several properties in Boston, including the very building where Maple and Soul is located. "He left you full ownership of it." Olivia blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "The building?" Margaret nodded. "Yes, as well as a sum intended to cover maintenance costs for the foreseeable future." For a moment, Olivia was sure she was dreaming. Her restaurant had been struggling under the weight of rent and expenses for months. Owning the building outright meant security, freedom. No more monthly payments to a landlord who barely acknowledged her. No more sleepless nights wondering if she'd be able to keep the doors open. But why? Why would a man she barely knew do something so immense? Margaret seemed to anticipate the question. "Mr. Bennet frequented your restaurant years ago, before you took over. He had a connection to this place, though he never went into detail about why. When he made these arrangements, he was firm in his decision. He wanted Maple and Soul to survive." Olivia swallowed the lump forming in her throat. The weight of the gesture pressed into her chest. "There has to be more to this." Margaret's expression darkened slightly. "There is. And I should warn you. His former business associates are contesting his will." Olivia's stomach sank. "Of course they are. The case will be complicated," Margaret admitted. "But legally, his will is solid. If you want to keep this inheritance, you'll need to be prepared for a fight." Olivia leaned back, exhaling sharply. Just yesterday, she had been worried about making it through another month. Now, she was being handed something incredible, only to realize that it wouldn't come without a price. She looked out the window, watching the city move around her, unaware of the storm brewing inside her mind. Richard Bennet had changed her life with one decision. But was she ready to accept it? The cafe remained silent as Olivia traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. The weight of Margaret's words pressed down on her. Ownership of the building. Security for Maple and Soul. And yet, with it came the looming specter of a legal battle. Ethan sat across from her now, having arrived minutes after she had called him in a daze. His expression was unreadable as he skimmed the documents Margaret had left behind. "This is insane," he muttered, setting the papers down. "This guy barely knew you." Olivia let out a slow breath. "I know. But Margaret said he had a connection to the restaurant from years ago." Ethan leaned back, crossing his arms. "That doesn't explain why he'd leave you all this. People don't just hand over buildings to strangers." "I'm not saying it makes sense, Ethan," Olivia replied, rubbing her temples. "But it's real." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And now his old business partners want to contest it. This could turn into a mess, Liv. You don't have the money for lawyers and court battles. I don't, she admitted. But if I walk away, I lose everything. The restaurant won't survive another year paying rent. This could save it. Ethan studied her carefully, his jaw tightening. Are you sure this is what you want? Tying yourself to a man's past when you don't even know the full story? That was the question gnawing at her. She had been given an opportunity that most people would dream of: security, a future. But accepting it meant stepping into a world she didn't understand, facing opposition she hadn't anticipated. She stared at the documents again, the ink bold against the crisp white paper. Richard Bennett had left her something valuable, not just a building but a chance. And for reasons she couldn't yet understand, she felt a responsibility to see it through. I need to know more, she finally said. About Richard. About why he did this. Ethan frowned. And how are you going to do that? She straightened her shoulders. I'm going to dig. Margaret must have more information. Maybe there are records, people who knew him. I need to understand why he chose me. Ethan sighed, shaking his head. I don't like this, Liv. I know, she said, a small, weary smile playing on her lips. But I think I have to do it anyway. The decision settled in her chest, heavy but certain. She had been handed a mystery alongside an inheritance, and she wouldn't be able to walk away without uncovering the truth. She just hoped she was ready for what she might find. The hum of conversation filled the law office, but Olivia barely noticed. She sat across from Margaret Reed, her fingers gripping the armrests of the stiff leather chair. A thick folder lay between them, filled with documents outlining the challenge to Richard Bennett's will. Margaret flipped through a few pages before looking up. They're claiming undue influence, she said matter-of-factly. That you manipulated Richard in some way, convincing him to leave you the building. Olivia let out a short, incredulous laugh. I met the man once. Margaret nodded. I know. But to them that's a convenient defense. They're arguing that he was vulnerable, that his state of mind was compromised, and that your brief interaction somehow swayed him. That's ridiculous, Olivia said, shaking her head. He came into my restaurant, I gave him soup, and he left me a letter. That's it. Margaret sighed, leaning forward. Unfortunately, perception matters. Richard had assets that many people wanted. His former business partners have been eyeing that building for years. Now that you have it, they see you as an obstacle. Olivia rubbed her temples. So what happens next? They've filed a formal challenge. This means a court hearing, legal fees, and a drawn-out process. It could take months, even years. Margaret studied her carefully. Are you prepared for that? Olivia's stomach churned. She had never set foot in a courtroom, let alone faced something this big. But if she backed down now, she would lose the restaurant, and the security Richard had given her. I don't have a choice, do I? She murmured. Margaret's expression softened. Not if you want to keep what he left you. A heavy silence settled between them. Olivia thought of Maple and Soul, of the nights she had spent worrying over rent, of the staff who relied on her. She had been given a gift, and now she had to fight for it. Then I'll fight, she said, her voice firm despite the nerves twisting inside her. What do we do first? Margaret gave a small nod of approval. First, we gather everything. Richard's medical records, testimonies from people who knew him, any evidence that proves he made this decision on his own. Olivia swallowed hard but nodded. Okay, where do we start? Margaret slid another file across the desk. With his past. The file Margaret had handed Olivia sat on her kitchen table, unopened. She had spent the entire evening staring at it, as if the papers inside could change the course of her life the moment she read them. Ethan sat across from her, arms crossed, waiting. You're going to have to look eventually. I know, Olivia murmured. She took a deep breath, finally reaching for the folder and flipping it open. The first few pages were standard legal documents, outlining Richard Bennett's estate and financial history. But then she found something unexpected, a collection of handwritten notes and articles, all mentioning Maple and Soul. Some of them were old, yellowed at the edges, while others were more recent. Her brow furrowed. Why would Richard have all of this? Ethan leaned in, scanning the papers with her. Looks like he followed the restaurant for years. She turned to a page that looked like a journal entry. The ink was slightly smudged, but the words were clear enough. Maple and Soul still stands. I wonder if she knows how much this place meant to my mother. I wonder if she ever found out who used to sit at that corner table every morning, watching as she made something beautiful out of nothing. Olivia's heart pounded. His mother. Ethan's eyes widened. Wait, you don't think? Memories from her childhood resurfaced. Her grandmother telling her stories about the early days of the restaurant, about a quiet woman who always sat in the corner, drinking coffee, never speaking much but always tipping generously. Sharp inhale. His mother was a regular here. Ethan rubbed his jaw. That explains why he left you the place. This wasn't random, Liv. A wave of emotion washed over her. Richard hadn't left her the restaurant out of whimsy or charity. This was personal. This was gratitude. Tears prickled at the edges of her eyes. I need to know more. Ethan nodded. Then let's start digging. The weight of uncertainty that had been pressing down on Olivia lifted just slightly. She wasn't just fighting for a building. She was protecting a legacy. The courtroom was colder than Olivia had imagined. The sterile air, the quiet murmurs of attorneys preparing their cases, the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. None of it felt real. Yet here she was, sitting beside Margaret Reed, waiting for the proceedings to begin. Across the room sat Richard Bennett's former business associates, men in tailored suits who had no interest in his legacy, only in what it could profit them. Their lawyer, a man with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, glanced at Olivia before addressing the judge. Your Honor, we maintain that Miss Carter had no meaningful relationship with Mr. Bennett. His decision to leave her such a significant asset is, at best, suspect and at worst, the result of undue influence. Margaret stood. Your Honor, my client had no prior knowledge of Mr. Bennett's estate before his passing. The idea that she manipulated him is absurd. In fact, the evidence we have gathered tells a very different story. The judge, a stern-looking woman with silver-streaked hair, adjusted her glasses. Proceed. Margaret walked toward the bench and placed a folder before the judge. We have records of Mr. Bennett's personal notes, journal entries, and letters detailing his long-standing connection to Maple and Soul. His mother was a regular there for years. She spoke highly of the restaurant and the kindness she received. Mr. Bennett himself visited the establishment numerous times before it came under Miss Carter's ownership. Olivia watched as the judge skimmed through the documents, her expression unreadable. The opposing attorney, however, wasn't ready to back down. A sentimental connection does not justify leaving such a significant portion of an estate to a near stranger, he argued. Mr. Bennett's mental state should also be considered. Was he truly of sound mind when drafting this will? Margaret had anticipated this. She retrieved another file and handed it to the judge. We have testimony from Mr. Bennett's physician, stating that he was fully cognizant and aware of his decisions when his final will was drafted. Additionally, we have a signed statement from his legal team confirming his intent. The room fell into a tense silence as the judge absorbed the information. Olivia's pulse pounded in her ears. This was it. Everything depended on how the judge interpreted the evidence. After what felt like an eternity, the judge cleared her throat. The documents provided support the claim that Mr. Bennett made this decision of his own volition. There is no substantial evidence of coercion or manipulation. A murmur spread across the room, but the judge raised her hand for silence. Given these findings, I see no reason to contest the legitimacy of the will. The inheritance remains with Miss Carter. Relief flooded Olivia's body. Margaret squeezed her arm reassuringly, but Olivia barely felt it. The weight she had been carrying for weeks suddenly lifted. Maple and Soul was safe. Richard's wishes had been honored. As they left the courtroom, Ethan was the first to reach her. "You did it," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You actually won." Olivia exhaled, a slow, steady breath. "Now we make this place something more." Margaret had suggested she sell the property, walk away with a financial cushion, and start fresh. But Olivia knew that was never an option. Richard Bennett had entrusted her with this place for a reason, and she intended to honor that trust. She had spent the last few nights scribbling down ideas, envisioning what Maple and Soul could become. It wasn't just about keeping the restaurant afloat anymore. It was about giving back, the same way Richard's mother had once been cared for here. "I want to expand the cafe," she said, glancing at Ethan. "Not just as a restaurant, but as a space for the community. Somewhere people can come when they need a meal, no questions asked." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Like a soup kitchen?" "Not exactly," Olivia said, shaking her head. "A hybrid place where people pay what they can. Those who can afford it help sustain those who can't." Ethan let out a low whistle. "That's ambitious." Olivia smirked. "You're the one always telling me to think bigger." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fair point." As they spoke, the front door creaked open. A familiar figure stepped inside. Margaret, her expression unreadable. Olivia felt a flicker of uncertainty before the lawyer offered her a small, approving nod. "I heard about your plans," Margaret said, crossing the room. "It's bold. Do you think it's crazy?" Olivia asked. Margaret tilted her head, considering. "Maybe. But the best ideas usually are." A slow smile spread across Olivia's face. It was crazy, but it felt right. For the first time in a long while, Olivia wasn't just fighting to survive. She was building something bigger than herself. And as she looked around the restaurant that had become her home, she knew this was just the beginning. Months had passed since Olivia made the decision to transform Maple and Soul into something more than just a restaurant. The renovations were complete, the new business model was in place, and the grand reopening was finally here. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the scent of fresh pastries and roasted coffee. Olivia stood at the counter, watching as people trickled in. Some familiar faces, some new. There was a hum of quiet excitement, a sense that something special was happening. Ethan nudged her shoulder. "Look at this," he said, motioning toward the door where a family hesitated before stepping inside. "You did it, Liv." She exhaled, a slow smile spreading across her face. "We did it." The new Maple and Soul was a place where anyone could sit down for a meal, regardless of their circumstances. Pay-what-you-can system ensured that no one would be turned away. The community had embraced the idea, and already local businesses had stepped up to help fund the initiative. Margaret entered a few minutes later, dressed impeccably as always. But this time, there was something softer in her expression. She approached Olivia with a small envelope in hand. "What's this?" Olivia asked, taking it cautiously. Margaret smirked. "Open it and see." Olivia unfolded the letter inside, her heart skipping a beat as she read the words. "Final confirmation. Full ownership transfer of Maple and Soul has been legally processed. No remaining disputes." Her breath hitched. She had fought so hard for this, and now it was truly hers. "Thank you," she whispered, emotion thick in her voice. Margaret simply nodded. Richard would be proud. The words settled deep in Olivia's chest. She glanced around the bustling restaurant, watching the people who had come to share in this moment. This wasn't just her victory. It was a legacy continued, a tribute to kindness passed down through generations. As the day unfolded, laughter filled the air. Coffee cups clinked against saucers, and the warmth of something greater than success settled in Olivia's heart. This was just the beginning. Olivia thought she had simply offered a warm meal to a stranger, but what if that single act of kindness was the key to a life-changing mystery? As secrets unravel and challenges arise, will she be able to protect the legacy left in her hands? Or will everything she fought for slip away? What would you do if an unexpected inheritance came with a battle you never saw coming? Click on the video on the screen to continue this journey of self-discovery and resilience. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story that makes you question: how far would you go to fight for what truly matters?